The Nix of the Mill Pond, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a miller who lived with his wife in great contentment. They had money and land, and their prosperity increased year by year. However, ill luck comes like a thief in the night. As their wealth had increased, it again decreased year by year, and at last the miller could hardly call the mill in which he lived his own. He was in great distress, and when he lay down after his day's work, he found no rest but tossed about in his bed, full of care. One morning, he rose before daybreak and went out into the open air, thinking that perhaps there his heart might become lighter. As he was stepping over the mill dam, the first sunbeam was just breaking forth, and he heard a rippling sound in the pond. He turned around and perceived a beautiful woman rising slowly out of the water. Her long hair, which she was holding off her shoulders with her soft hands, fell down on both sides and covered her white body. He soon saw that she was the Nix of the mill pond, and in his fright he did not know whether he should run away or stay where he was. The Nix made her sweet voice heard, called him by his name, and asked him why he was so sad. The miller was at first struck dumb, but when he heard her speak so kindly, he took heart and told her how he had formerly lived in wealth and happiness, but that now he was so poor that he did not know what to do. "Be easy," answered the Nix. "I will make thee richer and happier than thou hast ever been before. Only thou must promise to give me the young thing which has just been born in thy house." "What else can that be," thought the miller, "but a young puppy or kitten?" And he promised her what she desired. The Nix descended into the water again, and he hurried back to his mill, consoled and in good spirits. He had not yet reached it when the maidservant came out of the house and cried to him to rejoice, for his wife had given birth to a little boy. The miller stood as if struck by lightning. He saw very well that the cunning Nix had been aware of it and had cheated him. Hanging his head, he went up to his wife's bedside, and when she said, "Why dost thou not rejoice over the fine boy?" he told her what had befallen him, and what kind of a promise he had given to the Nix. "Of what use to me are riches and prosperity?" he added, "if I am to lose my child, but what can I do?" Even the relations who had come to wish them joy did not know what to say. In the meantime, prosperity again returned to the miller's house. All that he undertook succeeded. It was as if presses and coffers filled themselves of their own accord, and as if money multiplied nightly in the cupboards. It was not long before his wealth was greater than it had ever been before. However, he could not rejoice over it untroubled, for the bargain which he had made with the Nix tormented his soul. Whenever he passed the mill pond, he feared she might ascend and remind him of his debt. He never let the boy himself go near the water. "Beware," he said to him, "if thou dost but touch the water, a hand will rise, seize thee, and draw thee down." As year after year went by, and the Nix did not show herself again, the miller began to feel at ease. The boy grew up to be a youth and was apprenticed to a huntsman. When he had learnt everything and had become an excellent huntsman, the lord of the village took him into his service. In the village lived a beautiful and true-hearted maiden who pleased the huntsman. When his master perceived that, he gave him a little house. The two were married, lived peacefully and happily, and loved each other with all their hearts. One day, the huntsman was chasing a roe. When the animal turned aside from the forest into the open country, he pursued it and eventually shot it. He did not notice that he was now in the neighborhood of the dangerous mill pond. After disemboweling the stag, he went to the water to wash his blood-stained hands. As soon as he dipped them in, the Nix ascended, smilingly wound her dripping arms around him, and drew him quickly down under the waves, which closed over him. In the evening, when the huntsman did not return home, his wife became alarmed. She went out to seek him. He had often told her to be on guard against the snares of the Nix, and not to venture near the mill pond, so she already suspected what had happened. She hastened to the water, and, upon finding his hunting pouch lying on the shore, could no longer doubt the misfortune. Lamenting her sorrow and wringing her hands, she called on her beloved by name, but in vain. She hurried across to the other side of the pond and called him anew. She reviled the Nix with harsh words, but no answer followed. The surface of the water remained calm, with only the crescent moon staring steadily back at her. The poor woman did not leave the pond. With hasty steps, she paced around it without resting, sometimes in silence, sometimes uttering a loud cry, and sometimes softly sobbing. At last, her strength gave out, she sank to the ground and fell into a heavy sleep. A dream soon took possession of her. She was anxiously climbing upwards between great masses of rock. Thorns and briars caught her feet, the rain beat in her face, and the wind tossed her long hair about. When she reached the summit, a different sight presented itself to her. The sky was blue, the air soft, and the ground sloped gently downwards. On a green meadow, gay with flowers of every color, stood a pretty cottage. She went up to it and opened the door, where an old woman with white hair beckoned to her kindly. At that very moment, the poor woman awoke. Day had already dawned, and she resolved to act in accordance with her dream. Laboriously, she climbed the mountain, and everything was exactly as she had seen it in the night. The old woman received her kindly and pointed out a chair on which she might sit. "Thou must have met with a misfortune," she said, "since thou hast sought out my lonely cottage." With tears, the woman related what had befallen her. "Be comforted," said the old woman. "I will help thee. Here is a golden comb for thee. Tarry till the full moon has risen, then go to the mill pond. Seat thyself on the shore, and comb thy long black hair with this comb. When thou hast done, lay it down on the bank, and thou wilt see what will happen." The woman obeyed all the instructions precisely. As soon as the full moon appeared, she carried the golden spinning wheel to the shore and spun industriously until the flax was finished and the spool was filled with threads. No sooner was the wheel standing on the shore than a more violent movement occurred in the depths of the pond. A mighty wave rushed up and bore the wheel away with it. Immediately, the head and the whole body of the man rose into the air in a waterspout. He quickly sprang to the shore, caught his wife by the hand, and fled. They had scarcely gone a short distance when the entire pond rose with a frightful roar and streamed out over the open country. The fugitives saw death before their eyes. The woman, in her terror, implored the help of the old woman, and in an instant they were transformed, she into a toad and he into a frog. The flood that had overtaken them could not destroy them, but it tore them apart and carried them far away. When the water dispersed and they both touched dry land again, they regained their human form, but neither knew where the other was. They found themselves among strange people who did not know their native land. High mountains and deep valleys lay between them. To keep themselves alive, they were both obliged to tend sheep. For many long years, they drove their flocks through field and forest, full of sorrow and longing. When spring once more broke forth on the earth, they both went out one day with their flocks, and by chance drew near each other. They met in a valley, but did not recognize each other, yet they rejoiced that they were no longer so lonely. From then on, they drove their flocks to the same place each day. They did not speak much, but felt comforted. One evening, when the full moon was shining in the sky and the sheep were already at rest, the shepherd pulled a flute out of his pocket and played a beautiful but sorrowful air. When he finished, he saw that the shepherdess was weeping bitterly. "Why are you weeping?" he asked. "Alas," she answered, "the full moon shone like this when I played this air on the flute for the last time, and the head of my beloved rose out of the water." He looked at her, and it seemed as if a veil fell from his eyes. He recognized his dear wife, and when she looked at him and the moon shone on his face, she knew him too. They embraced and kissed each other, and no one need ask if they were happy. The Little Folks' Presents. A Fairy Tale by the Brothers Grimm. A tailor and a goldsmith were traveling together, and one evening, when the sun had sunk behind the mountains, they heard the sound of distant music, which became more and more distinct. It sounded strange but so pleasant that they forgot all their weariness and stepped quickly onward. The moon had already arisen when they reached a hill where they saw a crowd of little men and women who had taken each other's hands and were whirling around in the dance with the greatest pleasure and delight. They sang most charmingly, and that was the music the travelers had heard. In the midst of them sat an old man who was rather taller than the rest. He wore a parti-colored coat, and his iron gray beard hung down over his chest. The two remained standing full of astonishment and watched the dance. The old man signaled for them to enter, and the little folks willingly opened their circle. The goldsmith, who had a hump and, like all hunchbacks, was brave enough, stepped in. The tailor felt a little afraid at first and held back, but when he saw how merrily everything was going, he plucked up his courage and followed. The circle closed again directly, and the little folks went on singing and dancing with the wildest leaps. The old man took a large knife hanging from his girdle, whetted it, and when it was sufficiently sharpened, looked round at the strangers. They were terrified, but they had not much time for reflection, for the old man seized the goldsmith, and with the greatest speed, shaved the hair off his head cleanly. The same thing then happened to the tailor. Their fear left them when, after he had finished his work, the old man clapped them both on the shoulder in a friendly manner, as if to say they had behaved well to let all that be done to them willingly, and without any struggle. He pointed with his finger to a heap of coals lying to one side, and indicated to the travelers by his gestures that they should fill their pockets with them. Both obeyed, although they did not know of what use the coals would be to them, and then they went on their way to seek a shelter for the night. When they had reached the valley, the clock of the neighboring monastery struck 12, and the song ceased. In a moment all had vanished, and the hill lay in solitude in the moonlight. The two travelers found an inn and covered themselves on their straw beds with their coats, but in their weariness forgot to take the coals out of their pockets before doing so. A heavy weight on their limbs awakened them earlier than usual. They felt in their pockets and could not believe their eyes when they saw that they were not filled with coals, but with pure gold. Happily, the hair on their heads and beards had also grown back, as thick as ever. They had now become rich folks. The goldsmith, who in accordance with his greedy disposition had filled his pockets better, was twice as rich as the tailor. A greedy man, even if he has much, still wishes to have more. The goldsmith proposed to the tailor that they should wait another day and go out again in the evening to bring back even greater treasures from the old man on the hill. The tailor refused, saying, "I have enough and am content. Now I shall be a master, marry my dear object," for so he called his sweetheart, "and be a happy man." To please his companion, he stayed another day. In the evening, the goldsmith hung a couple of bags over his shoulders to stow away as much as possible and took the road to the hill. He found the little folks singing and dancing, just as they had the night before. The old man shaved him clean again and signaled for him to take some coal away with him. Without hesitation, he filled his bags, returned delighted, and covered himself with his coat. "Even if the gold does weigh heavily," he said, "I will gladly bear that," and fell asleep with the sweet anticipation of waking in the morning as an enormously rich man. When he opened his eyes, he got up in haste to examine his pockets. He was amazed to find nothing but black coals, no matter how often he put his hands in them. "The gold I got the night before is still there for me," he thought, and went to fetch it, but was shocked to see that it had also turned into coal. He smote his forehead with his dusty black hand, and felt that his whole head was bald and smooth, as was also the place where his beard should have been. His misfortunes were not yet over. He then noticed for the first time that, in addition to the hump on his back, a second, just as large, had grown on his chest. Recognizing the punishment for his greediness, he began to weep aloud. The good tailor, wakened by this, comforted the unhappy fellow as well as he could and said, "You have been my comrade in my traveling time. You shall stay with me and share in my wealth." He kept his word, but the poor goldsmith was obliged to carry the two humps for the rest of his life and to cover his bald head with a cap. The Giant and the Tailor. A fairy tale by the brothers Grimm. A certain tailor who was great at boasting, but poor at doing, decided to go abroad for a while and explore the world. As soon as he could manage it, he left his workshop and wandered on his way over hill and dale, sometimes here, sometimes there, ever onward. One day he saw in the blue distance a steep hill, and behind it a tower reaching to the clouds, rising out of a wild, dark forest. "Thunder and lightning!" cried the tailor. "What is that?" Goaded by curiosity, he went boldly towards it. Upon nearing it, He saw that the tower had legs, leapt in one bound over the steep hill, and now stood as an all-powerful giant before him. "What dost thou want here, thou tiny fly's leg?" cried the giant, with a voice as if thundering on every side. The tailor whimpered, "I want just to look about and see if I can earn a bit of bread for myself in this forest." "If that is what thou art after," said the giant, "thou mayst have a place with me. If it must be, why not? What wages shall I receive? Thou shalt hear what wages thou shalt have. Every year 365 days, and when it is leap year, one more into the bargain. Does that suit thee?" "All right," replied the tailor, thinking, "A man must cut his coat according to his cloth. I will try to get away as fast as I can." The giant then said to him, "Go, little ragamuffin, and fetch me a jug of water." "Had I not better bring the well itself at once, and the spring too?" asked the boaster, and went with the pitcher to the water. "What, the well and the spring too?" growled the giant in his beard, for he was rather clownish and stupid, and began to be afraid. "That knave is not a fool, he has a wizard in his body. Be on thy guard, old hands. This is no serving man for thee." When the tailor had brought the water, the giant bade him go into the forest, cut a couple of blocks of wood, and bring them back. "Why not the whole forest at once with one stroke? The whole forest, young and old, with all that is there, both rough and smooth?" asked the little tailor, and went to cut the wood. "What? The whole forest, young and old, with all that is there, both rough and smooth, and the well and its spring too?" growled the credulous giant in his beard, and was still more terrified. "The knave can do much more than bake apples, and has a wizard in his body. Be on thy guard, old Hans. This is no serving man for thee." When the tailor had brought the wood, the giant commanded him to shoot 2 or 3 wild boars for supper. "Why not rather 1,000 at one shot, and bring them all here?" inquired the ostentatious tailor. "What?" cried the timid giant in great terror. "Let well alone tonight, and lie down to rest." The giant was so terribly alarmed that he could not close an eye all night long, thinking about the best way to get rid of this accursed sorcerer of a servant. Time brings counsel. The next morning, the giant and the tailor went to a marsh, surrounded by a number of willow trees. The giant said, "Hark thee, tailor, seat thyself on one of the willow branches. I long to see if thou art big enough to bend it down." All at once, the tailor was sitting on it, holding his breath, and making himself so heavy that the bough bent down. However, when he was compelled to draw breath, it hurried him, for unfortunately he had not put his goose in his pocket, so high into the air that he was never seen again, to the great delight of the giant. If the tailor has not fallen down again, he must be hovering about in the air. 184. The nail. A merchant had made good deals at the fair, sold all his goods, and lined his purse with gold and silver. Now he wanted to journey home and be at his house before nightfall. So he packed his saddlebag with the money on his horse and rode off. At noon, he rested in a town. When he wanted to continue, the stable boy brought out his horse and said, "Sir, there's a nail missing in the horseshoe on its left hind foot." "Let it be missing," replied the merchant. "The 6 hours I still have to travel will surely hold the shoe tight. I am in a hurry." In the afternoon, after he had dismounted again and had his horse fed, the servant came into the room and said, "Sir, your horse is missing a horseshoe on its left hind foot. Should I take it to the blacksmith?" "Let it still be missing," replied the man. "The few hours remaining will surely be endured by the horse. I am in haste." He rode on, but not long after, the horse began to limp. It didn't limp for long before it began to stumble, and it didn't stumble for long before it fell down and broke a leg. The merchant had to leave the horse where it was, unbuckle the saddlebag, put it on his shoulder, and walk home on foot, where he did not arrive until late at night. "For all this misfortune," he said to himself, "that cursed nail is to blame." Haste makes waste.